Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today I'm going to be starting our coverage of the 2015 Zurich Chess Challenge, one of the most prestigious events all year. This tournament actually last year had the highest average rating of any chess tournament in the history of the world. That was an average rating of 2801. This year we have 5 top 10 players, and the 6th player is in the top 12. So we have the 2nd place player in the world, Fabiano Caruana, playing some of the best chess in the world right now. In the 6th rating we have Vichy Anand, so he actually just lost to potentially win the World Chess Championship to Magnus Carlsen. 8th, we have Vladimir Kramnik. 9th, Levon Aronian. 10th, Nakamura. And 12th, we have Sergei Kardiakin. So as you can see, this field is stacked. There's not too many people. They only really invite the best of the best. So excited to have this tournament over the next week or so. So we're going to go ahead and get started today with an exciting match between Caruana, the second-rated player in the world. In my opinion, one of the best next to Magnus Carlsen, and one of the youngest that has a potential to actually overtake Magnus Carlsen in the years to come. So he's always exciting to watch from Italy. So Caruana is going to be taking on Nakamura. Nakamura from the United States, going to be playing the black pieces. So definitely going to have a challenge in front of him playing against such a strong young player with the white pieces. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it. Caruana starts with pawn to e4, aggressive opening, nice from him. Nakamura, pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, pawn d6, again this is the Sicilian defense. Knight takes here on d4, knight f6, knight c3. And then Nakamura has a lot of different options to choose from. He decides to go for the Najdorf defense, which is, if you kind of look at it, it kind of looks like a strange opening, but actually does a lot, accomplishes quite a bit in the Sicilian defense. It really locks down the square here on b5, which is a key square for white. White really wants to kind of control this. So pawn to a6 is somewhat of a just setting up a good position for black that he can maybe later on extend on the queen side if he wants to. Pawn here to b5. He can always get his queen involved into the game. So very, very nice move from Nakamura. Now, Caruana decided to go for an interesting move here, and he played pawn to h3, something that I don't see very often. It's kind of gone out of favor in the past few years. Way more common would be bishop to g5, and then followed by pawn to f4. Again, very aggressive, taking a very aggressive line on the king side. Other moves that I see a lot in the Najdorf defense is the bishop to e3, but decided to go for something a little bit different. So pawn to h3. You can definitely tell that he prepared specifically for this tournament against the Najdorf defense, because we see some interesting moves from him. Pawn to e5. This does allow Caruana to later on attack this backward pawns here on d6, so something that Nakamura is going to be thinking about in the back of his mind. And then knight back here to e2, and this is kind of what I was talking about as far as this is you can tell that he prepared for this line, because knight to e2 is not a move you see very often. It blocks the development of the bishop, or the bishop here on f1, also blocks the development of this queen here on d1 if it kind of wants to go to a diagonal. Knight here to b3, very common. Even just coming back here, knight to f3, still controlling the center of the board, opening up the center for the queen to get involved. This light square bishop, very, very powerful. But Caruana, being a strong player, prepared for this and said knight to e2 was the move that he wanted to go with. Pawn to h5. So Nakamura deciding to be a little bit aggressive on the king side. Wanted to kind of lock down the square here on g4. It does potentially make any castling a little awkward for him. Usually not in the Sicilian defense going to see castling on the queen side. So if he does decide to castle on the king side, is going to have to make sure that he doesn't have to worry about all this pressure, because his pawns have extended a little bit further than you typically want to have when you castle on one side of the board. Caruana continues with pawn g3, knight to d7, getting this knight more involved into the game. Bishop here to g5. And then bishop here to e7. So Nakamura's opening up the door if he wants to go ahead and decide to castle on the king side. Both sides, again, don't have the most protection as they typically would want. If you fianchetto your bishop here to g2, typically your pawn's going to be on h2. So both sides may decide to castle, but definitely not going to be as strong as defense. So they're definitely going to have to keep an eye on that. Nakamura could decide to go ahead and keep his king in the middle, but it's probably going to be a little bit safer just to castle on the king side, not having to worry too much since only one pawn is kind of extended here on h5. We now see pawn pushing forward to a4, basically counterattacking this square here on b5. Always really wanted to control it. His bishop can come out here, his knight here to b5, so he doesn't want black to just control this the entire game, especially if black wants to push forward with pawn here to b5. So just trying to take some of the squares away that black might want to go to. Now we see the knight coming here to c5, just centralizing it, attacking some of the central squares here on e4, also attacking this pawn here on a4. Bishop here to g2, just going to try to control this long diagonal as long as possible. Bishop here to e6, both sides just getting all their minor pieces involved into the game as fast as possible. Pawn here to a5. You know, Fabiano had a few different options he could have played. I really like the pawn to b4, forcing the knight to come back here, and then playing pawn to a5. Definitely extends the pawn structure a little bit further on the queen side, but I think this is definitely playable. Decided to play a little bit differently and played pawn up here to a5. And then after the pawn comes down here to b5, he plays en passant and actually captures here on b6. Yes, this is a legal move. I know for some of maybe the newer players, this looks weird. But if your opponent plays up his pawn 2 squares, you have one move and one move only to capture like this. It does look a little funny. But after the queen plays, white now plays pawn here to b3. And this is kind of what he was going for. That's why he didn't play the pawn here to b4, although I still think he could have. This basically allows him to control this square here on a4, and also a somewhat central square here on c4. Now Nakamura decides to go ahead and castle on the king side. Caruana falls right behind with castling on the king side as well. And then pushing forward with pawn to a5, queen up here to d2. Just want to make sure you get it involved into the action. It's still controlling the center of the board, but now it allows to kind of control this knight here on c3 and also controlling this bishop here on g5. Rook over here to c8, so you can see a lot of pressure being put on Nakamura on the queen side. Rook over here to d1. And then pawn to a4. And this is an interesting move in the game. It's pretty much equal on both sides. Now, Caruana may have a slight advantage because he went first, and so he still has maybe a slight tempo advantage. But Nakamura plays an interesting move. Pawn hits at a4, and I think this is a great move because it really takes a high-level thinking player that it's kind of at the top of his game to give up material for a setup that he likes a little bit better. So after the pawn takes here on a4, he now plays bishop here to c4, recognizing that, hey, he just didn't want to have to worry about this pawn here on b3. It was really holding down the square here on c4. That's where he wanted his bishop, and he's okay giving up material if his pieces can be in a better position. But it's very hard to find, definitely very hard to play that move, especially in the first game against such a talented player as Caruana. So it's not clear right now how Nakamura is actually going to take this advantage or take this sacrifice that he gave up and turn it into an advantage. Caruana definitely right now still has the material advantage. So both sides, you know, have something they're playing for. Nakamura is going to try to control the center of the board, especially now that he has the bishop here on c4. Caruana is going to try to hold on to his material advantage and then try to just exchange pieces off as much as possible, get towards the end game being up a pawn, and then potentially see if he can actually win the game or have a pretty easy draw. We now see pawn to a5, and then the queen comes back here to d8. This is probably a lot better than, you know, rook taking here on a5, and then bishop taking on f6. We see the rook come down. We see an exchange on e7, rook taking over here, and then the queen taking. Probably not nearly as good for black, so just decides to go ahead and play his queen back here to d8, which is completely fine. Now the bishop comes off the board. Again, we kind of talked about what both sides are going to be looking to do here. So bishop to f6. The queen up here taking his backward pawn here on d6, which usually has a hard time having someone defending it. So he wants to go ahead and exchange off queens if possible. Nakamura decides to go ahead and take, doesn't want to have to deal with anything crazy. You know, you could see a rook taking here on a5, and then the queen takes, the bishop takes. Now the rook comes up here on d8, and then all of a sudden black is down in material. That's going to be bad. So it's very important that Nakamura exchanges correctly, and that's what Fabiano Caruana wants him to do right now. He wants to go and exchange off that queen on the board. He's, again, up in material right now. Knight up here to b7, attacking the rook. The rook's just going to come back here to d2. Now this rook comes down here to a5, taking that material. Caruana is still up in material by 1 pawn, but Nakamura has the aggression right now. His rooks are very active. This bishop here on c4 is doing a whole lot. Both of these bishops here on f6 and g2 aren't doing too much, but we do see Nakamura with the bishop, the double bishop pair, which in an open game, which this is, since the pawns aren't kind of controlling the entire board, a lot of times are very difficult for players to play against, because double bishop pairs can just control so much of the board. We now see rook over here to b1, attacking the knight. Knight coming down here to c5, centralizing. Knight up here to d5. Really great square for this knight. It's a great outpost. He does have the pawn here on e4. It'd be great as well for Nakamura if he had a piece, let's say a minor piece here on d4. So great central square for this knight. Going to be very difficult for Nakamura to do much unless he wants to go ahead and exchange, which he probably doesn't want to exchange even more material if he doesn't have to. Definitely doesn't want to give up his double bishop pair if he doesn't have to. Bishop coming back here to d8. Pawn up here to h4, trying to give a little bit of room here on the king side. Rook down here to a3. Knight here to c3, protecting this knight as well. Rook over here to a8. So Nakamura's plan is simple. He wants to try to get all of his pieces over here on the queen side and start to attack. Caruana still wants to just exchange off as much material as possible. Just doesn't want to have to worry about any of the attacking over here on the queen side. Rook down here to d1. Bishop here to a5, trying to get into the action. Now the knight's going to come up here to b5. Wants to start to going on to the attack. Rook down here to a2. Anytime you can get your rook to the 7th rank if you're white, or on the 2nd rank if you're black, that's going to be good. Very difficult for your opponent to really deal with, but we do see the bishop come up here to f3. And then a pawn here to g6, just solidifying this pawn chain right here. Knight up here to e7, forcing the king to move. Now the knight comes back here to c6. Probably don't want to do anything too crazy right now. You don't have to really try to take material right now if you're Fabiano Caruana. Just make sure you don't make any mistakes on board. Knight over here to a4. Knight up here to d6. Probably better than taking here on e5. Then you could see the bishop take here on b5, rook taking on b5, then the knight down here to c3. Probably just way too much trouble for Fabiano to deal with. So instead decides to just go ahead and play knight here to d6. Not under a ton of pressure right now. Bishop coming back here to e6, and then rook up here to b7. So Nakamura first brought his rook down here to a2, and now Fabiano Caruana has done the same. He brings his rook up here to the 7th rank, exactly where you want to do it, putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. He now has his knight and his rook attacking this square here on f7. So white starting to put a lot of pressure on black. Black has to find something to do, because you can tell he's down in material and he has yet to find a way to kind of use that sacrifice and actually turn it into any sort of advantage. We now see the rook taking here on c2, attacking this knight. The knight's going to now come to e5, taking that material right there. Knight over here to c5. Now the rook's going to swing over here to e7, attacking this bishop right here. King up here to f8. So Caruana is trying to be pretty aggressive. Knight up here to c6, trying to get his minor pieces a little more in the center of the board, a little higher though. Now we see knight to b3, pawn pushing forward to e5, solidifying this outpost here on d6, and then bishop here to b6. Very, very telling move of Nakamura. He wants to attack this square here on f2, and white has to deal with it right away. He has the rook here on c2. He really wants to come down, take it with his bishop, and then he can have a discovered attack. Unfortunately for Caruana, he plays a fatal mistake, something you typically don't see from him, but he plays rook over here to b7, and that does not stop this bishop at all, coming down here to f2, which is what Nakamura plays without much hesitation. Now the king moves to a g2. The bishop's going to come back here to c5, a discovered attack with the rook here on c2, and after the king comes back here, the rook's going to swing down to a2, and Caruana decides to go ahead and resign in this position. There's just nothing that he can really do with both of these rooks and this bishop here on c5 controlling this long diagonal. There's no real way for white to kind of hold on to here. Sometimes the viewers will ask, well, how's this even a lost game? So if you kind of run it through a computer and kind of look at the best moves possible, all white can really hope for is to kind of stop the threat right here. So bishop here to g2. The knight coming down here to d4, stopping the bishop right here. Rook over here to h1. Now we can just see the bishop take. If the rook takes here, all of a sudden the knight can just take that. You can check if he wants to try to slow it down a little bit, but all that's going to do is delay the inevitable. After the king moves a little bit, you can get the knight involved into the game, and it's going to be checkmate for Nakamura. So a really great game. It didn't go all the way. Fabiano resigned well before then, but really great game from Nakamura. Played well the entire game, even giving sacrifices up in material because he trusted his position and his pieces, and he knew what to do with them. So really excited that we had such an exciting game coming out of round one, especially at these high levels. Sometimes it's almost expected that you're going to see just tons of draws, but a little disappointed in Caruana, one of my favorite players, to see him actually lose this game after playing well. With a line that we don't see very often, maybe starting some theory in the h3 move and the Najdorf the defense from white. Kind of disappointed to see him falter at the end, but congrats to the American Nakamura. First game, he's in the lead right now, so we're going to be having continued coverage throughout the entire tournament, so definitely check back. But hopefully you guys enjoyed watching this video, learned something. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.